Ever feel like you're just sinking, overwhelmed by the weight of it all? Our first instinct is usually to just try harder, right? To be stronger. But what if the real solution isn't about our strength at all? What if it's a completely different spiritual principle, one that's way more powerful? Let's dive into that. So to really get this, let's jump into a story that just perfectly captures that sinking feeling. Picture this. The Apostle Peter, in this incredible moment of faith, he actually steps out of a boat and starts walking on water toward Jesus. I mean, what a moment. But it's about to take a very dramatic turn. And you know what? That is so us, isn't it? The second we take our eyes off our source of strength, we notice the wind and waves, the deadlines, the conflicts, all the overwhelming circumstances. Fear just rushes in and we start to go under. That cry, Lord, save me, that might just be the most real, most human prayer ever. So in this moment, Peter's failing big time. How does Jesus respond? Does he give him a lecture, a big "I told you so"? Just think about it for a second. What was the very first thing he did when Peter cried out for help? And this is the whole point. His response wasn't a lesson. It was a rescue. Instantly, Jesus reached out and caught him. And that tells us something so profound. Every single time we cry out, his first response is always an outstretched hand. Okay, so Peter's storm had actual wind and real waves. But the Bible suggests that our storms, they often have a deeper spiritual side to them. We're not just fighting bad circumstances, we're actually in an unseen battle for our own well-being. The book of John lays out this really stark contrast. It's like two opposing forces. On one side, you have an enemy whose entire mission is to steal, kill, and destroy. But on the other side, you have Jesus, who comes for the exact opposite reason, to bring us life and life to the absolute fullest. And this verse from Ephesians, it completely flips the script on what we think our struggles are all about. It's telling us that our real fight isn't with people or our finances or our health problems. The real battle is with these unseen spiritual forces. And that means we need a completely different strategy to win. So, if the battle is spiritual, what happens when we try to fight it with our own human toolkit, our own strength, and our own smarts? Well, that's when we walk right into a pretty dangerous trap. Proverbs gives us this really fascinating warning. It says that destruction doesn't come from being weak. It actually comes from something called haughtiness, a condition of the heart that pretty much signals that a fall is coming. So what in the world is this haughtiness? It's more than just being arrogant. It's that deep down belief that says, I got this. It's relying on our own strength, our own intellect, our own plans. It's that subtle but dangerous voice that tells us our way is always the right way. And this path of pride, it's predictable. It leads to a destructive pattern. We end up isolating ourselves. We get defensive and rage against any advice that challenges our way of thinking. And pretty soon, we're totally trapped, believing our way is the only way. It's a recipe for disaster. Okay, so if fighting harder in our own strength is just a dead end, what's the alternative? This brings us to the core solution here, and it's all about a radical transfer of weight. So right at the core of what we're talking about today is this incredible verse from Corinthians. Just think about what it's saying. It describes this complete divine exchange where we are given the very righteousness of God. This isn't just a nice idea, it's a foundational truth, and we're about to unpack what it really means. Okay, so it's one thing to read a verse like that and nod along, right? But it's a whole other thing to actually live it out. How does becoming the righteousness of God actually translate into our daily struggles, our worries, our decisions? That's the real question, and that's what we're tackling today. But to really get the solution, we've got to first face the problem. And the biggest obstacle that stands in our way is, our own instinct. That deep-seated habit of relying on ourselves, of trying to go it alone. And this is where it gets really interesting. It all kind of boils down to this fundamental conflict. On one side, you've got our own strength, our own smarts, all the stuff we naturally want to trust in. And on the other side, you've got the call to trust God. This is the battleground, right here, where our faith gets real. The book of Proverbs actually gives us these two fascinating character profiles that just perfectly illustrate this trap of self-reliance. And they might seem like total opposites, but as we're about to see, the wounded and the strong, they both end up in the exact same spot. So let's start with the first one, the wounded. This verse, wow, it paints a really powerful and maybe even a familiar picture. It's talking about someone who pulls away, who isolates themselves, driven by their own pain or what they want, and they end up just fighting against any advice that could actually help them. So let's break that down for a second. The path for the wounded always starts with isolation, pulling back. And that isolation, it just fuels this focus on their own desires, which then makes them rage against any wisdom. You can see the sequence, right? It shows exactly how they walk right into a trap, totally cut off from the help they desperately need. Okay, now for the other side of that coin, the strong. You think, hey, being strong is a good thing, right? But these verses, they reveal something kind of shocking. Haughtiness, pride, comes right before destruction. And it's the strong men who are ultimately taken down. So who are the strong? Well, they're the ones with a proud heart. The folks who depend completely on their own physical power, or maybe even more common today, their own intellect, their own smarts. Their greatest asset becomes their biggest weakness because it stops them from ever looking for help beyond themselves. And this right here, this verse just nails the core problem for both the wounded and the strong, and for all of us, really. We are so convinced that our own way is the right way. We trust our own perspective without even thinking about it. But this verse is a reminder that there's a deeper reality. God is looking at the heart. And the solution is this really powerful idea, a radical transfer of weight. Now, this isn't some passive wishful thinking, it's a deliberate action. It is the conscious choice to take all the things that are weighing us down, our anxieties, our worries, our burdens, and to hand them over. So how do we actually do this? It's not as complicated as it sounds. It really comes down to 3 key actions. First, you have to know what you're carrying. You've got to identify the specific burden. Then comes the pivot point. You make a conscious decision to not handle it yourself. And finally, you actively transfer it. You deliberately place it on his shoulders and let go. And listen, this next point is absolutely crucial, the most important part of this whole thing. This transfer isn't about you trying to convince God to help you or trying to earn his support. It's about accepting a gift that's already been given. The work that was needed to carry your burdens, it's already finished. So what's the payoff? What really happens when we make that transfer? Well, this is where everything starts to change. It's where things get truly transformative. This beautiful verse from the Gospel of John gives us the perfect metaphor for it. When we make that transfer, it's like opening a door or flipping a switch. The light that is Jesus shines directly into our own personal areas of darkness. And think about it. It's a basic law of physics, right? Darkness can't exist where light is present. It's not a fight. The darkness just goes away. And that's not just some poetic idea. It's a spiritual reality that has a direct real-world impact on the things we call darkness, like depression, anxiety, and worry. Okay, but let's be real for a second. A question probably pops into your head right about now. This all sounds great, but what happens when I mess up? What if I try this and then I just take the burden right back? What if I fail? It's a fear we all have. And here it is. Here is the definitive, amazing, reassuring answer. The whole system is designed with our imperfection in mind. The promise is that if we confess when we fail, God is faithful to forgive and to cleanse. There is always a way back. Failure is never the end of the story. Remember that verse we looked at earlier about the haughty heart, about pride coming before destruction? Well, it has a second half. Pride comes before destruction. Yes, but before honor comes humility. This is the divine pattern. True, lasting honor never comes from lifting ourselves up. So at the end of the day, the choice is pretty clear. We can go the way of the strong and the wounded, relying on our own intellect, our own desires, a path that leads to destruction. Or we can choose the path of humility, that radical transfer of weight, which is the only path that leads to real honor. If it's true that every way seems right in our own eyes, if our own perspective always feels correct, then maybe the most important question we can ever ask ourselves is this: what burden, what anxiety, what part of my life am I choosing not to see through the lens of humility and trust? And here it is, folks. This is the big takeaway. The solution isn't to just muster up more willpower or get smarter. The real answer is to adopt a spiritual posture that the world often sees as weakness, but is actually the secret to unlocking incredible power: humility. Let's redefine humility for a second, because it's not about thinking less of yourself. Not at all. It's actually a powerful and courageous choice. It's the intentional act of taking all the worries, all the anxieties, all the burdens that are crushing you and deliberately placing them onto God. So why is this so powerful? Why does this work? Well, this verse from James lays it all out. Humility is the key that unlocks grace. God actually resists those who rely on their own strength, but he freely gives his unearned favor, his grace, to the humble. Now, this all sounds great in theory, right? But what does it actually look like day to day? How do we do it? Let's move on to the practical steps for how to make this a real practice in our lives. It starts with a command that, let's be real, sounds almost impossible. Be anxious for nothing. How can anyone do that? Well, the key isn't to ignore anxiety, but to actively replace it with this powerful combination of prayer, specific requests, and gratitude. So here's your practical 4-step process. First, you pray about everything. Turn every single worry into a grateful request. Second, you have to intentionally shift your mind. Focus on what is good and true. The third step is a conscious act of humility. You literally place yourself under God's care. And finally, you cast your cares. You deliberately hand them all over. And what's our motivation here? Why can we do this? It's not just some spiritual exercise. It's a response to a beautiful truth. We can confidently hand over all our anxieties for one simple, powerful reason: because he genuinely cares for you. This entire act is built on the foundation of his love. So, as we wrap this up, the final question is for you. Think back to Peter sinking in that storm. What are the winds and waves in your life that you've been trying to face in your own strength? What cares are you ready to cast today?